Previously on Lloyd Meets the Mormons. I've started to get more engaged with the local expat scene here in Croatia. And one thing that became very quickly apparent when I started doing this was that there was a Mormon presence. In their minds, they are engaging me in a study. In my mind, I am trying to sow some seeds.
When I heard your story, it was really emotional for me.
I asked them what the bottom line was. What's your goal in preaching to people? Hello and welcome to the 6th installment in this series in which I recount my encounters with members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. As you can see, I am in the bunker for this one. It's just more convenient. And I'm having to search my memory a little bit more because I'm filming this on the Monday and I met with the members of the church on Thursday. So I'm having to remember events that happened 4 days ago. But I'm going to do my very best to recollect what was, I think, our 5th conversation. And it was in some ways the most intriguing one because rather than this rotation continuing where I just feel like I'm being passed from pillar to post, I was again speaking to the lady from South Africa who was with us for, I think, the first 2 conversations, or with me for the first 2 conversations. And accompanying her was, again, I'm being very careful not to mention names, but the lady from the previous conversation, I think the previous 2 conversations, who will be studying to be a nurse, who I've praised in the past for the fact that, unlike Jehovah's Witnesses, at least Mormons allow their members to go through higher education. So it was those 2 ladies that I was speaking to. Apparently, again, one of the first ladies, the American lady who I spoke with the first time, has since moved to Split. So it's perfectly understandable that, you know, I'm not going to be able to speak to the same 2 people who I first started speaking to. Anyway, we met in Zagreb. The cafe where we normally have our conversations was very noisy with the music for some reason. So we found a bench a little bit further down the other side of the main square. And we had this conversation on the bench, and it was a little bit weird because we couldn't sit opposite each other. We were sat on the bench. So I was sat here, a lady from South Africa was sat next to me, and further along the lady from America who will be studying to become a nurse. So we kind of sat in a row like that, and I was having to kind of turn around to speak to them. What was really interesting, bear in mind, they had promised that this conversation would, not promised, but they had suggested, I'm being very careful to be fair with my words, they had suggested that this conversation would take place via Zoom, and it would be with some kind of Mormon master who I think is in Split, who could apparently answer all my questions, or at least had a chance of being able to answer my questions. But they explained that for whatever reason, they couldn't do that, at least, you know, on this occasion. So they were meeting with me instead in person. What was very interesting was they were clearly rattled by some of the arguments that I'd made earlier on in our conversations, to the point where it felt almost like they needed to sit down with me and express to me the fact that it had unsettled them and offer the rebuttals that they'd kind of been forced to content themselves with, if that makes sense. So in particular, they were clearly unnerved by the verse in 2 Nephi 5:21, which I've read before on this series, but let's read it again, just for those who are coming to this series for the first time. 2 Nephi 5:21, and he had caused the cursing to come upon them, yea, even a sore cursing, because of their iniquity. For behold, they had hardened their hearts against him, that they had become like unto a flint. Wherefore, as they were white and exceedingly fair and delightsome, that they might not be enticing unto my people, the Lord God did cause a skin of blackness to come upon them. So I talked about this verse in multiple times in previous conversations, and they were clearly still grappling with it and trying to offer their defenses to it. And particularly, I would say, the lady from South Africa, which surprised me because she seemed to be the most senior of the two, freely said that it had been on her mind. And so we had this conversation that was sort of mostly about that. And I even said at one point, I guess the difference between us is that I don't have any reason to justify this verse, you know? I can imagine if I'd grown up in a culture where I was surrounded by people who had veneration for a particular book, and there was a certain expectation that I would also have a veneration for this book, I can imagine it would be very, very difficult for me to strongly object to one of the verses in the book. Whereas, because I haven't grown up in that culture and I'm, viewing this from the perspective of a total outsider, I'm able to read this verse, reach a very strong conclusion against that verse, and walk away and just think, well, there's evidence that it's written by men. Whereas, if I'd been brought up in the LDS church, there would clearly be an incentive, a very strong incentive for me to, I even described it as squaring the circle. And I also mentioned the sunk cost fallacy at one point during the conversation. I said, there's such a thing as the sunk cost fallacy as well, where because you have invested so much of yourself in terms of, your years of life and your emotion and your time in a particular set of beliefs, you have to keep investing in it because you're never going to want to cut your losses. You can't bring yourself to the point where you accept that you were perhaps lied to. And I even said at one point, can I ask you both a question? And they said, sure. I said, you know how Joseph Smith attended a different church before he had his revelation? And we spoke for a bit about to what extent that was true, but they both basically admitted in the end that he had been attending, I think, the Presbyterian church up to the point where he had his vision or his revelation. So I said, so he was a member of a Presbyterian church, and he changed his mind. He had a revelation that what he'd been taught before wasn't true or was only partially true, and therefore he walked away from it. So I said, that being the case with Joseph Smith, knowing that you are both heavily invested in the LDS church, at least in terms of your family being members, do you feel as though you are free to walk away if you were to discover that this isn't true? And they both said, yes, we do. We do feel that we would be free to do that. They said, because we have family members who've done that. We have family members who have stopped believing for whatever reason, and they're still embraced by the family. And I already knew that shunning wasn't as much of an issue in the LDS church as in Jehovah's Witnesses. That's not to say it isn't an issue at all. I think it's more a case of, if you, let's say you're a Mormon parent and your child leaves the church, if you really want to treat them in an awful way, or if you want to shun them, you'll probably be able to find excuses somewhere in the Book of Mormon or in LDS materials to distance yourself. But it's not mandated like it is with Jehovah's Witnesses. And what you find is that when things aren't mandated, when there isn't a command to shun, very often the human instinct, the paternal or maternal instinct to not pretend your child is dead, will override any leaning towards shunning or ostracism. So I already knew that to be the case, and I praised them that was the case for them. That was their personal experience, so that they felt free, if they ever did learn that it wasn't true, to leave. I've been very careful, I think, to praise them or give as much praise to the LDS Church where I've been able to. And there have been a few examples of where I've been able to do that. I've been very careful to make sure that I'm giving credit where credit is due. So that was an interesting point in the conversation. And I think it's very telling that I was able to ask that question without massive alarm bells and without them scarpering. You know, they dealt with my question in a very mature way, in a very calm way. And I just can't help but wonder whether I may have already reached a point where they are being affected by our conversations more than they perhaps expected to be. So anyway, we spoke for quite some time on this scripture in 2nd Nephi. And what ended up happening was they've given me homework for our next conversation, which will hopefully happen in the next few days. And I've agreed that I am going to research the homework that they've given me. It was actually quite adorable that the lady from South Africa had on her lap she had a notepad on her lap, and the page that was open had written in handwriting Lloyd at the top, and a big whole list of scriptures. And I said, it's really adorable that you've clearly spent some time preparing for our conversation, because I can see there you've written my name and you've got quite a few notes underneath. Do you mind if I have maybe a picture of the page, so that I can look up the verses that you've cited? And interestingly, after the conversation was over, this lady sent me at least part of the page. So on this image, you can't see my name, which is a bit of a shame. Probably, I would hazard a guess that it might be a little bit incriminating if it were to have my name at the top. But I have already, told them that I'm fine with them keeping personal data on me, I think. So anyway, you'll have to trust me that the original page has my name at the top. But if Tibor is gracious, here is the image that they sent of this lady's notes. And you can see there's in a little cloud, there's the title, How Can We Recognize the Spirit? And then there's a list of verses, both in the Book of Mormon and 3 there in the Book of John, in the Gospels. So Alma 32 verse 28, the Spirit enlightens the mind. Alma 19 verse 6, the Spirit replaces darkness with light. Messiah 5, 2-5, the Spirit strengthens the desire to avoid evil and obey the commandments. John 14:26, the Spirit teaches truth and brings it to a remembrance. John 14:27, the Spirit gives feelings of peace and comfort. John 16 verse 13, the Spirit guides to truth and shows things to come. Moroni 10 verse 5, the Spirit reveals truth. 2nd Nephi 31, verse 18, the Spirit glorifies and bears record of God the Father and Jesus Christ. 1st Nephi 2, 16 to 17, and 2nd Nephi 31, verse 1, and Alma 24, verse 8, the Spirit carries truth to the heart of the listener. And then, not in the list, but at the bottom there, Moroni 7, verse 12, whatever inviteth to do good is from God! Exclamation mark. So, again, pretty adorable that they've gone to the trouble of, at least this particular lady had gone to the trouble of sitting down at some point with her Book of Mormon and her Bible, which I noticed she actually had bound together in one volume, and coming up with this list of verses for me. And the idea is that I will be looking up each of these verses and giving my thoughts during our next conversation. In addition to this, they gave me links to 2 videos, both touching on this issue of racism in the Book of Mormon. The first video features a gentleman called Ahmad Corbett, and here is a brief clip.
People have asked me, how can you as a black man be a member of the Mormon church? Is the church racist? Or I thought the church was racist. What I tell them is that the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints is one of the most racially unifying organizations in the history of the world.
So the clip you've just seen is fairly indicative of the entire 2-minute, 22-second video. It, interestingly, doesn't even mention the verse in 2nd Nephi 5:21. It's, quite frankly, just some guy talking about how the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints isn't racist. And that, for me, is sort of dodging the argument. You can have a religion that isn't racist founded on a book that is racist, or at least contains one racist verse. So it wasn't particularly helpful for me, that particular video, and I will be making that point in our next conversation because they have asked me to watch it for my homework. The next video they gave me, which is a longer video, was more interesting.
I started reading it, and there's a lot of scripture or text in there that come off very racist. So that was a lot of our argument. I have a whole, like my whole back of my book is just as many times as it's like, it refers to, you know, the curse of blackness and their skin became white. And so I was arguing with him. I'm like, how can there be this religion and it's like faith in God, but yet there's so much text in it that just feels like you're alienating a whole group of people. Like, this is, for me as a black person, you're telling me, you know, that I'm cursed. I read 2 Nephi 26:33. For none of these iniquities come of the Lord, for he doeth that which is good among the children of men, and he doeth nothing save it be plain unto the children of men. And he inviteth them all to come unto him and partake of his goodness. And he denieth none that come unto him, black and white, bond and free, male and female. And he remembereth the heathen, and all are alike unto God, both Jew and Gentile. And so it was, that moment right there was, it was like an aha moment. So here I'd been arguing, you know, racism, and you know, we were talking about inequities and all that I did, and it's like, God loves everybody. You feel love, and you feel a forgiveness, and you feel a happiness and a peace, and it's just really a renewal of your life. It's like being born again. Like it sounds so cliche, but it really, really is. It's a fresh start.
So yes, a specific mention of the 2nd Nephi 5:21 verse. Interesting that they didn't actually show the text. They did show the text for another verse, which they claim makes it all okay, and was somehow compelling for Kellyanne, so that she ended up just becoming an LDS church member anyway. Very, very interesting. You'll have noticed that she said, I felt I had a choice between being a believer and being a skeptic, and I chose to be a believer. I think I'm going to make the point in our next conversation that cannot be how it works for me, you know? I don't choose to believe something. I know facts, you know? It's not like I go around finding things to be skeptical about and finding things to believe. Either things are true or they're not true. And I'm only going to believe that things are true if there is evidence for them. If that's called being skeptical, yes, I am a proud skeptic. I am proudly someone who doesn't just believe because he wants to, or because it's convenient for him, or because it gives him warm, fuzzy feelings, which seems to be what Kellyanne derived from the Book of Mormon, to the point where you get footage towards the end of the video, as you'll have seen, very eerily reminiscent of Jehovah's Witness propaganda, where someone's getting all tearful on camera and talking about their feelings, as though feelings trump facts and logic, which I'm sorry, they just don't, at least not for me. Because as I've repeatedly said to these ladies, it's just self-evident when you look at all the various different religions that all of them can furnish examples of people who believe passionately and have very, very strong feelings, to the point where they could bring themselves to tears describing their faith. If we're going to derive truth purely based on how people feel, then any number of religions can be true. Feelings are not a good arbiter of truth. They're just not. They can lead us in all sorts of terrible directions if we let them. So I think that's going to be my observation when I meet them next. It's a very interesting video. I'm fascinated by the fact that Kellyanne has pink hair, which absolutely would not be allowed in the Jehovah's Witness religion. Neither would it be allowed for Kellyanne to just get on a platform and share her beliefs, share her testimony, which elsewhere in the video she describes doing. Women aren't allowed to just freely talk in front of an assembled throng of fellow Jehovah's Witnesses in the Jehovah's Witness religion. So again, multiple examples of where the LDS Church is ahead of Jehovah's Witnesses, or at least not as backward as Jehovah's Witnesses. But certainly in that video, that 12-minute, 2-second Kellyanne video, nowhere is there a satisfying answer to the problem of 2 Nephi 5:21. It's just a case of, yes, well, the Book of Mormon does say this, but it also says this. Well, the thing that it also says doesn't excuse the thing that it said previously. As I've repeatedly said, you can send out an invitation to people of all colours. You can say, I'm inviting you to be my followers, whether you're black or white, and still you can hold racist thoughts. Still you can have feelings that we would describe as discriminatory. You can, in your mind, think, I'm inviting everyone, but really I prefer people of a certain colour. And that's explicitly described in 2 Nephi 5:21, because as I've already said, it's not just that it describes a skin of blackness as being a curse, it's that by contrast, it says that a white skin is delightsome. There's just absolutely no way around that. You certainly can't argue your way around it simply by quoting a verse that says something a bit different, because all you're doing then is showing that this book contradicts itself or gives conflicting thoughts on a certain subject, which is only, I would argue, proof that the book you're talking about or the book that you are scrutinizing is of human origin. Because books of human origin tend to have mistakes in them, or at least books claiming to be sacred texts that are of human origin tend to have mistakes in them. Same thing with the Bible and the contradictions in the Bible. So there's a few things for me to talk about in our next encounter, and I'm not sure how it's going to go. I sense that things are to some degree drawing to a close because both of us were sort of talking in the past tense almost about our exchanges, almost as though things are kind of coming to some degree of culmination. So I'm interested to see how the next conversation goes and whether there will be further conversations. I'm sort of already feeling like we're just kind of wasting time eventually. There has to come a point where all I'm doing is just repeating myself. Credit to the ladies. They will freely say and have repeatedly said, including in our last conversation, we don't have an answer to that. And it's actually quite alarming how many times that's happened while we've been talking. I've made like an argument, or I've presented them with my thoughts, and they've just said, that's a valid point. We don't really have an answer for you there. So if it's just going to be a case of conversation after conversation where that's the reaction, then I'm not sure I can justify continuing this. But I am open-minded to see what happens in the next conversation. I will be looking up each and every verse that has been brought to my attention. I'll be sharing my thoughts on the 2 videos. So yes, tune in for the next installment and I'll let you know how it goes. Next time on Lloyd Meets the Mormons. So, I just had my final conversation with the LDS Church members. I've basically ended it. They are, at least as far as I can tell, heavily indoctrinated. They're proud to shy away or to back away from these arguments or anything that contradicts their beliefs. I suppose that tells the story of the whole series of meetings. So overall, again, frustrating. And I can't help but wonder whether I was at one point starting to kind of feel like a seed might have been sown, but now I'm more thinking that perhaps the seed wasn't sown and it's just the wrong point in their lives to even be having these conversations.